Hi, Ben.
Hello.
All right, I wanted to do a follow-up video to the book video we did last time. And I wanted to start out with just saying that these were your memories of more than 20 years ago. And so some things could be a little out of sequence, and since you left the project before it was actually finished, there could be some things that you think happened but might not have been.
That's correct.
Sure. Yeah.
That's correct. Some of it is speculation on my part, and based upon what I knew, actually had experience with, and then watching as the events unfolded, and I didn't have direct information. I kind of extrapolated as to what may have happened, but it's more speculation than actual known fact.
But you were a part of things until the book was actually finised.
That is,
you had it actually all in PDFs.
All in PDFs
and complete, not published, but
we had it completed. But as I mentioned before, we went back. Well, we saw the appearance of our work, a few modifications to it, but essentially our work, come out by the trustees or whatever you want to call them. Essentially, they took our work without approval, and they replicated, as I mentioned before. And that's when Bill took a look at it, and as he was looking at it, he saw things that he recognized from most of it, all of it was our work, but he looked at it and and then he went back to our work and said, "Oh, I would have liked to have done this differently." And so I'm not sure if he would have gone back. Probably would have. He was a very powerful stickler for detail and wanted it done correctly. And as I mentioned before, I was wholeheartedly for that. So for whatever reason, we had all the volumes done, including V50, and as it appeared in that red book that came out from the estate. But Bill wanted to one last time run through it and work on it, massage it, and that sort of thing. And it was at that point I left, so I never did see that work.
That could have happened, you don't know. But
yes.
Basically, the book was done, and I know how memories can get fuzzy, and also dates can be a little off, perhaps, and
yes,
things like the number of copies you were going to print as a first edition, that might not have been.
That might not have been. Again, 20 years, and we were looking at, because we were cut away from the estate, and there wasn't those contractual obligations. All we were feeling an obligation to was Professor Galambos.
Right.
And we did know that there had to be a certain minimum number of them, because there was a thing that he came up with in his theory called natural estates. And in natural estates, that represented the intellectual achievements of the individual. And so every person, as Professor said, has a natural estate. Now, as to whether or not it'll be significant or not, that's a different subject. I mean, for individuals like Isaac Newton, who laid the foundations for modern civilization, his natural estate, once the theory gets going, will be staggeringly huge. So, based upon his theory, he was wanting a certain number of these first editions to be targeted for the eventual arising of natural estates. One, I think the very first one was to go to his father's natural estate. And I mentioned he looked upon his father as the example of the integrity engine. And then there was Isaac Newton and Maxwell and many of the early founders, Thomas Paine, the founders of the American Revolution, and that sort of thing. And so there were dozens and dozens of, especially of the lowest numbered versions of the first edition, that were already targeted for specific estates. So we had to make at least that number, and we had that list. I believe we had that list. Then we were over that number, and it wasn't 300. It was probably 50, 60 of those that have been already identified. Then the rest were above that were for sale. And he had, I think, sold 2,000 of them in his book contract, but we weren't linked to that anymore. And so that's when we considered, should we produce 2,000?
What do you mean you weren't linked to that anymore?
Well, the estate had gone on its own. We were still considered, well, in a way we were still part of the estate, because regardless of what the courts and the coercion and all the rest of it said about a literary executor, we took it and Bill Martin took it to mean that he was the executor of Professor Galambos' literary achievements, the production of those, not just the first one, but many of the other courses that were to come after that. So he took that seriously. So the contract for the first book, which, as I mentioned, Professor also got a ruling, said that he was no longer responsible because his estate couldn't bear the cost of that loss of that $2 million.
Oh, did you mention that last time? I don't think you did.
Okay, yeah, I might not have, but Professor.
You said that the guy, I don't remember his name, or even if you mentioned it, but you said he went to jail and that money was lost. But I don't remember you talking about a ruling that he wasn't responsible.
Okay, yeah, and so afterwards, Professor was in a position that he wanted to fulfill it, but he couldn't. His first edition could not be based, especially the standards that were going to be met. He could not produce 2,000 first edition copies, numbered copies, to provide to all the individuals. I believe what he was planning, and this is more speculation on my part, is that after he got the first ones done, and as the estate began to make money, as the theory moved ahead, which it would probably have done once it was published, that his estate would eventually come back and honor his moral obligations to all of these people. But at that point, it could not be the first edition. So it might be the second or third edition, limited edition, that would be put out to satisfy his contractual obligations. So based on that, that's what we were looking at. We didn't have the money based upon the support we were getting from that wonderful fellow that
you call him a noble graduate. Yes.
The noble graduate. The cost of that would have been prohibitive. The paper alone would have run to enormous amounts. But if we looked at something in the neighborhood of 300 or 400, and that's when it may have been Bill, it might have been Professor, I don't know where this came from, but we were looking at, okay, what constituted the first edition? And there were, I believe, there was the first edition for England, where it was originally published, and then there was a European edition that came later.
You're talking about Principia?
The Principia, that is correct. And that was in 400, and they thought that it was maybe 60 or 80 of the European, and so Bill wasn't looking at that maybe as the part of the first edition. So that's why we were kind of looking in the neighborhood, if I remember correctly. I think I said 306, but it might be like 320. I don't remember.
Yeah.
But it was in the low to mid 300s that we were looking to build.
Okay. All right. And we had a couple other minor details. One was the number of pages. I think you said the V50 volume had 500 pages, but then realizing you were talking about sheets
of
paper that were double-sided, so it's more like everything you said when you were talking about number of pages would actually be doubled, probably?
I think
Okay.
so, yeah.
All right, so that was more
it
like
made the
1,000
book-
pages, and then the
yeah,
entire set of volumes was more like 10,000?
10,000, but 5,000, not pages, but sheets
Yes.
and that sort of thing, yeah. I knew it was one of those things, it was just staggeringly large, and all you did, as we cranked through it, it didn't matter if it were 5,000 or 10,000 sheets. We were just going to go until we got the daggone thing done. And so it was just a large number of pages to get through and that sort of thing. So it was in that area. And I believe the total volume was 15 volumes, and the index was going to be between 600 and 1,000 pages, and maybe 1 or 2 volumes before it was all said and done. So it was quite extensive.
Okay. Big work.
It was, yes.
All right. We also talked about the binding, and you said that the trustees had said they were going to print it in paperback, I think was the term you used.
Something like that.
Yeah, and you said that wasn't exactly the proper term, because what we think of as paperbacks are actual paper or soft covers or something. But
yes.
you had a...
And I think they actually did what would be considered, quote unquote, a hard cover on it. Uh-huh. But what it really came down to was a term. There are several different ways of binding, holding the sheets together in one book. Mm-hmm. Then you have the outer cover, and so people think of that as the hard cover, which is legitimate. But a full hardcover book, there are several ways of doing it. A paperback is referring to the binding. The binding is what is the important thing.
Oh, not the covers.
Not the covers, but the covers are integral to the binding process. So, and that brings up, and after we spoke, I thought about it, and the idea about Smythe binding, like you said, it's 20 years, and these memories kind of bubble up to the surface and all.
Right.
It was Professor who wanted Smythe binding.
Right.
And in fact, I've got a couple of examples here.
Okay, show us what's meant by Smythe binding.
Okay, Smythe binding, if you look, and I'll hold this up to see if I can find it. Oh yeah, here we go. You'll see that. Can you see it there?
Yeah.
The strings.
I think we can see that.
Okay. All right. So what happens is that you punch holes. I think I mentioned you print them not as single pages. You print them in a big sheet, and then you fold them. And the interesting thing is when you fold them, the pages near the center of the folded group have to be shifted versus the ones on the further, because their orientation in the book slides in and out because of the thickness of it. And you have to take that into consideration. We already found the programs to do that. So what happens is that you have these booklets. You fold them into shape, and then you punch them and you sew them together, essentially. Mm-hmm. And the advantage to this, and this was called out by Professor, is he said, I want my books to lay flat. See how you can get really close to flat with that.
I see. Yeah.
So I don't know if you can see it on the table.
No, the table's not in view.
So when you laid it down, Professor, he hated books that you could not lay down flat like this and read. Uh-huh. And most of the present books, either paperback, which basically is the cheapest of the past. Basically, you get a piece of paper and you put glue down it, and you glue all those booklets on their edge together. And then there is finally a case binding, which this is an example of case binding. And what happens is it's not only some sewing together, but it's glued. And see, if you push on this, you see how it curls.
Yeah, it's not flat.
It's not flat. And no matter what you do, you will, if you push this to flatness, you will break the spine on this book. And Professor, I remember him talking about this on more than one occasion when he wanted to get it flat. He broke the spines on the book. And he did not want that for his book. And so one of the most ancient forms of binding is this, because this one, the case binding, is more based on glue and paper and that sort of thing. And it's quicker, it's more technologically quote unquote advanced, but on an operational basis, you can't do that.
Right.
And Professor said that not only was his first edition to be valued for what it was worth, but it was also to be usable. And usable, as I said, not now, but not just for now, but
for the ages.
For the ages. And so that, and after we talked about it, then we went back and found some examples of what the two were.
Okay. Well, I think of that when I see threads in a book like that. To me, it's like ancient, and I wonder, could you even get a publishing house to do that for you?
They still do it.
Oh, okay.
And what's interesting, I went online and looked it up. I already knew. I had found a Smythe binder. But what's interesting is that once you've done a Smythe binding, you can't pull a paper out. If you get a paper out, you can pull papers out of this. You can cut it and that sort of thing, and it won't look. But if you pull a piece out of this, the book will be destroyed. And so what they now do, where they do Smythe binding, is binding patents. They take the original innovators' notes, and they'll send them off to a Smythe binder and Smythe bind it so that people can't insert copies and text after it's been set into the thing, or they can't remove something. So it's a kind of security. So yes, they still do it. And of all places, they're still doing it for patents.
Okay.
Is one area, yes.
Okay, interesting. So let's see what's next. You had something about the copyright, something you thought of after we talked. You remember what that was? Yes.
Okay. We were dealing with an attorney, but obviously he wasn't knowledgeable in this particular area, and he didn't bother to go get it. When you write a book, so if you have someone write a book and on a typewriter or a word processor and that sort of thing, and just puts the text out and creates the content. That is the first copyright. But if you then take that and you put pictures into it and you structure it and you put the typesetting and all the processes that go into changing that text into a final book to be shipped to the public, printers and sent out into the world, that is also a copyright. But that copyright, like patents, can be assigned to people. The original owner of the copyright is the one that produces it. And then if you go into contract with someone, you can, the one who is providing the money can write the contract in such a way as to have the transfer of the copyright upon completion of the contract. And what we learned is there is a very specific set of terms called work for hire. So if you say this contract is a work for hire to produce, and then in the contract explicitly state what the person is supposed to produce in that, The work for hire means that you are working for hire. As Bill Martin and I and Eric did, if they had put that into the contract and sent it to us and we signed that contract, then the copyright of the layout would have been no longer ours. But in the contract, Bill read through this, and I do believe he already knew before he signed the contract what those terms meant. And so I believe there was nowhere in the contract it said this is a work for hire. And so that's why, at the time, just as we were about to, we went our separate ways, but right before that, they published our work and put it out in the way they did. And but they didn't when they contracted it with us a year and a half before, they didn't bother to write that term. So we still held at that time our copyright in the work. And that's a hard and fast. That wasn't like literary executor, which was questionable. This is hard, fast, well-established legal precedents. And so they did not express who held the contract, and nor did they use the language that it signified the transfer of that upon finishing of the contract. So the result was we still held our contract, the copyright for our work. So.
Okay. So did you ever get a copy of the book?
I never did.
You paid for it, though.
Oh, yes. The one with the estate. Mm-hmm. And at that time, they knew where I was.
So it wasn't that they didn't know where you were.
No, because they knew, because I had been sitting there.
Uh-huh.
And if they had any questions as to how to reach me, they could have contacted Bill, said, we've got our books. But neither Eric Falvey bought it, Bill Martin bought it, and I bought it. And they never bothered to send us 3 copies.
Huh.
Any
idea why? Well, I suppose you have an idea about that. But you don't know for sure.
I don't know for sure. I understand a lot of other people got their copies. But I would just say that it was a contentious separating of the ways between our little group and the trustees. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, we were expressing a desire to make sure that it met the requirements that were set out by Professor. And we didn't think that they were quite willing to live up to those standards. But it's a difference of opinion, I guess.
I guess. Okay, you may have already answered this question, but I think I'll ask anyway, just in case we uncover something new.
Okay.
So your group had a plan to have it published or printed.
Right, printed. That's different.
Publishing is a different term.
Yes.
Okay, so you had a plan to have it printed, and you're not sure exactly why that didn't happen, or
all of that happened before. After
you were gone. So you don't know. You just have an idea of why.
Yes, and Bill may have made the decision at that point. They had the paper. Mm-hmm. They had the printer. However, I was the one that had interfaced with the printer. And Bill was, as I mentioned before, he was not one that was into the technologies and engineering and all the rest of it. And so all of the details and all the subtleties, I told him a lot about this, but it wasn't that I was trying to hold back the information and make myself invaluable. I was trying to do the exact opposite. But he did not have all of that knowledge. And then there was also the issue of the copyrights. But the real issue on the copyrights is that if you print it all up, copy to have the right to copy, But if you copy it, you produce a bunch of copies and put it into storage and never goes out into the world, I'm not sure where the law sits with regards to that. So if we hadn't gone our separate ways, what I would have loved to have done is to have seen that book, since we had the paper. And we had a man who was willing to go all the way to the completion with it, because that fellow, the honorable graduate, I think would have been, he'd already put a great deal of money into it, and to put in another 100 or so to make sure that it got printed and bound. So and if we went all the way through, when we got them out and we printed it, we would have gone through and we would have numbered them. And we would not. Professor promised to put hand signing. But it was understood, I haven't seen the contract, that if you got it printed, and he is now long since dead, there was no way to publish it. But what they did...
No way to sign it.
There was no way to sign it.
Uh-huh.
But the state, and we saw this, they took checks, canceled checks, from his estate, and Professor talked about canceled checks. They are, especially for significant men, every single check represents a piece of his history and belongs to the estate. And they took his property. And if he was around, if he could come back from the dead and find out they took his canceled checks, incorporated them into a book, and sent them out, he would have railed on them one side up one side and down the other.
Oh my.
It would have been like taking canceled checks from Isaac Newton and pasting it into the first editions. I mean, you don't do that.
Yeah.
And they did it. So we were going to number each one of them. However Bill would have done that, it would have been a work of art, and he would have done it right. That's the nature of Bill, especially when it came to this. So we would have had them numbered. Now the question is do we take one of his signatures that he had and transcribe it? You could do that and put it in the book. Again, thank goodness, that was a decision I did not have to make. But I know, again, Bill would have done it correctly. But to put a check in, we would never have done that. So we would have numbered them. And then once we had the sets, we would have made sure that those in the low numbers that go to those individuals that, as Professor said, as Newton said, he quoted Newton all the time, he was standing on the shoulders of giants. That's how he saw further, the same way that Newton, and he was making sure that at least a partial payment of his gratitude to those who he was standing upon, the shoulders he was standing upon, would have received their copies. So we would have honored that, and then we would have had some left over, and probably the lower copies would have probably been justified to go to Bill, to Eric, myself, and the graduate, and then we would have had the rest to sell. I would have been happy to have gotten the last numbered one. For me, it wouldn't have mattered where I fell in that, and then I would have had the expense of keeping it in a lockbox somewhere, because that book had to be stored. But that's kind of where we were. But what was the question again? I
don't remember either.
Okay, good.
Let's see. I think did that have to do with the copyright?
Copyright, yes. And so we would have copied them. And then I would have loved to have gone back to the estate. Oh, this brings up the next question.
Which question? And I'll ask it. You can ask it.
Okay. What do we do now?
Oh, well, save that for a minute.
Okay, save that
because
for a
I
minute.
do have that
You have that?
I do have that to ask.
Okay.
But there's a couple other things that probably should come before.
Okay, yes.
Before that. And the one thing I'm curious about is that the trustees knew that you had produced that first volume because you gave them
yes.
the vellum-bound copy.
Right.
Did they know you finished the whole thing?
Now, when you ask that,
yeah.
See, it's projectionism. I'm sure you're familiar with the term psychological projectionism. You're in the middle of doing the work, so you think you're everybody else who, remotely familiar with it might know this. But once we had the split, we didn't have any more contact with them. The only contact they had was we had a meeting, and we sent out letters. I think I might have mentioned.
You mentioned that in the
and that's how the honorable noble graduate came into the thing.
Were the trustees there at the meeting?
No. Oh, heavens, no. Oh goodness gracious. There might have been some that were in contact with him. Mm-hmm. But we made it clear that we wanted to continue on if we could find the financing. But to that group, we never even told that we found someone who was honorable enough and noble enough and not so dedicated to his shekels and his money to be willing to pay for this for the noble task. So even that group had no idea whether or not we were able to find the financing.
So, the group that you called together that
yes,
day.
We were just asking them for support. And I do believe, it's been so long, but I think there was a little contention between Bill and some of the group. But I may or may not have mentioned that when I did the presentation, and I did it in
You did it? Oh, okay.
Bill gave the presentation.
Okay.
I produced the presentation based on what Bill wanted, and we had done it all. And
so it was a PowerPoint kind of thing?
Yeah, PowerPoint, and something went wrong, and I had to do the what's essentially cascading style sheets in HTML, but the standard background for the slides went goofy. So, and the reason I bring this up is I was trying to fix it and hold this slide presentation together so it went well with Bill. And so most everything that was going on around me at that time was kind of a blur because I was going, I got to hold this. But I just kind of remember it. So Bill wasn't overly excited about going back to the group to let them know whether or not we succeeded. So I think once we found that individual, went out to dinner, and we had experiences, and then we went to his place where he lived, and we spent some time there. Bill and I went, and we talked and so forth, and worked out the details. After that, we were sub rosa. There was no communication. We just went back to our little office sitting over the Pacific Ocean. And then, since we had the money, we had everything we needed, and we had our little group, we just started on. And now that you ask the question, unless Bill or one of the 3 or 4 in the group, there was 4 of us, the one that's financing it, and Bill, Eric, and I. But then there was his wife and a few of the family and very close friends, that I knew, and I knew because of Bill, was in that small group that was around Bill. There was no word. So now that you ask the question, there's a really profound possibility that even to this day, they don't know.
Well,
now
after this is on YouTube, then
yeah.
Maybe
what I'm saying is until the publication of the last video, and someone digging it up and pointing it to them, up until that point, they may be in a position to not realize that Bill fulfilled his moral obligation to Professor, and he truly, profoundly did not believe he had any moral, much less legal obligation to the trustees. His whole honor and dedication was to Professor and Professor's wishes. And as I mentioned before, they violated those concepts over and over again. And then finally, to take our work without our permission, they took the book, they walked out the door, we never heard from them again, and they never even bothered to call us back to let us know they were going to even use it as the basis of their work.
Did they ever give it back?
No.
Oh. They thought they'd paid for it, so it was theirs? Is that
yes.
how they thought it was?
But Professor pointed out, and these guys know this, that intellectual property in the theory of primary property is not transferable. Patents and copyrights, quote unquote, say you can transfer it from the producers to secondary because they give you some shekels, some little money. Mm-hmm. But this is one of the profound insights, and it needs to be the basis of our civilization, or it's going to go away forever. Our civilization, and that is, unlike tangible goods that can be exchanged for money, intellectual property, once it's created by an individual, is forever that individual's. So, for example, Newton's theory of relativity can't be bought by Joe Schmo, and this is one of the examples Professor used in B201, can't be bought, I'll give you $100, and now it becomes Joe Schmo's theory of relativity. Theory of Newtonian mechanics. It doesn't work that way. Intellectual property, always, on a rational, moral, persistent basis, is the property and ownership of the innovator, and it can never be transferred. Why I bring this up is these guys the trustees had sat in Professor's theory, not only for V50 and V201, for hundreds of, who knows how many hundreds of other lectures and how many other courses. And Professor hammered this over and 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 over again. And so when they went and they published it, I believe, and so Professor said that you never ever act upon the position that that property is now yours. And so this is the most ironic thing in history. The theory they were supposedly putting out was based, and in that theory, not V50, that's the beginnings, that's like kindergarten. Mm-hmm. The advanced stuff, the theory, when it gets out and we survive, or if it doesn't and then we go into oblivion. And that really, and now that I've lived for 60 years, I'm seeing deeper and deeper how true that is. When this theory gets applied, which is what my life is about, the trustees will be considered one of the greatest criminals of all time, because they violated the very theory that they are supposedly protecting by stealing our intellectual property.
Right.
It doesn't matter what the copyrights are. It doesn't matter what the patents are. We're living by a different standard. And they are supposed to. And they are supposed to be running the first natural estate. That means they were calling, I think they were going to call it, or have called it, or changed it into a natural estate. As soon as they changed it to that term, they have then declared themselves living according to his theory. And you went out, and I mean you, I'm talking about the trustees, went out and published our work knowing it was our work, without working with us and getting full contractual obligation. Even if you had put work for hire, which you hadn't, it still wasn't yours. The law may say it's yours, but you know, as Professor's theory says, the law is going to kill us. Mm-hmm. And so your whole foundation, your whole justification now is not the moral foundations of Professor Galambos' theory. It is your claim because you have the law behind you. But on the higher ground of Professor Galambos' theory, they stole it. And they then think that they are in a moral position to be able to use other people's property and use Professor's theory, when they've already demonstrated they are colossal primary thieves. It's just absolutely amazing. And it's the irony.
Oh, gosh. That
what
must
do you
make
do?
you just...
You can kind of hear it in my voice.
Well, now that brings me to another question, because that's just amazing. But we do have to move on.
Yes.
Do you know any reason why you shouldn't be talking about any of this?
On a moral basis?
Or any basis.
Okay. There's only legal basis and a moral basis. And they are not the same.
Right.
The the twain may never, seldom, if ever, meet. So based upon Professor's theory, Professor spoke to it in his audiences, both those who have paid for his book and before it, that he wanted the book published. Made it publicly known. That wasn't controlled, secret, thing. We acted upon Professor's wishes as expressed in his trust. Bill was literary executor. And as long as Bill was around and alive, he was a literary executor. He is now passed. He's passed it on to someone, but now we're back to whoever he has passed it on. Didn't sit there for 2.5 years and work all the details out and do what I did. I have a primary property in this. My thoughts, my ideas, and my actions. So I'm a co-innovator in this book. So the primary innovator, Bill Martin, who I'm giving, do you think I'm giving enough credit? Am I giving?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm never.
No, yeah, absolutely.
So now, and even Bill Falvey. Eric Falvey. And there was a section of time when we were doing the book, he took a vacation for 3 or 4, I forget how many months, went off to Australia. Mm-hmm. That was fine, and he was doing the indexing, and so the indexing fell upon Bill's shoulders and then my entering. So there was a big section of that book. It was only Bill and I. And then Eric came back and joined the group, and we were happy to have all the help we could. And he came back and he worked with us, and then after we had our split, Bill and I, then he took over the final editing steps for redoing the V50. So I'm a co-inventor, not primary innovator. Bill did that. The primary innovator is, of course, Professor Galambos.
Right.
Then we were following his wishes, and then Bill volunteered to bring me in. Now Bill is gone. There is 20 years. We let the state time, and no results.
Okay, so
that's the moral ground.
So that's a great point for me to bring in the question that you started to answer earlier, and that is, based on the theory, how do you think this lack of disclosure of Professor Galambos' work could be resolved?
Okay, that brings us back. Because Professor Galambos addressed this. There's a reason this bloody book is 15 volumes of 500 pages each.
Mm-hmm. Or 1,000. Or
1,000 pages, 1,000. It's staggering.
Whatever. It's a big book.
He, over the 10 years or 15 years that he came up from the postulatory structure to the development of the layout of the theory in 1968, all manner of questions came up. Questions after questions after questions. One of the primary questions is okay, innovators don't live forever. no one lives forever. So what happens upon the death of the innovator? Now, the grand old world we live in, with all of its intellectual communism, oh, well, it now belongs to the world. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to pay, so we're a good communist, so we'll use Isaac Newton and we'll never pay for the value we received. Professor said, well, I'm not a good communist. He called it, he was a capitalist, and I have some shifts on it, but free market. But free market and intellectual. And in the free market, there is one fundamental principle that holds true. Most important is that in a free market, you pay for the value you receive. Now, when you receive value from someone else, there's a negotiation as to how much that value measured in money might be, but you always pay for the value you receive. What that payment is going to be, who knows? But you always pay. And if you can't pay to the person, you figure out how you can get out of that indebtedness. So Professor says, I'm not a communist. I believe in the free market. I believe in freedom. Newton did this work. I didn't. I received value from Newton. Therefore, I need to pay Newton. But Newton's not around. And then he started looking around and saw there are all these things of men in the past in the financial world and production world, like Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. All the men who did this work are all long since dead. They made the railroads and oil and all the rest of it. But their estates perpetuated. And he says, Rockefeller and Carnegie, they're nothing compared to Isaac Newton. In another 1,000 years, no one will know who Carnegie is. But if we have a civilization, Newton's name will be printed even greater than it is today. So that's what we need. We need a trust. That's where natural estate trusts come from. But who's going to run the trust? Especially if everybody starts to honor their market, the value they received and pay for it. That could turn into a lot of money. So who's going to run that money? Are we going to vote and pick one person with that much power? No. He said, we go back to the free market the same way we do everything. There's going to be competition. So for the great ones, and I'm going to talk to the camera now, to the trustees, you aren't nearly as great as you think. And you are definitely not Galambos. And so the theory already establishes it. You have competing natural estates. And that's what needs to be set up.
Are you going to do that?
We shall see. If I get the right support and we find the right players and we can act, we still have the legal issue. It's not the moral grounds. Mm-hmm. And the trustees may go another step deeper into immorality and power of legality, and may try to prevent competing natural estates for Professor Galambos.
Why do you think they're preventing everything and stopping all the publication and
I think
being so tight with the information?
I think I'm just speculating now. Mm-hmm. But Professor talked about this many times. And he used Hooke, who was a major physicist at the time of Newton. He wasn't anywhere as magnificent as Newton. I mean, you can look across the history of mankind. You might see Archimedes. There's Newton. There might be Maxwell. These men are like supernovas against the backdrop of intellectual background of humanity. But Hooke had dreams of glory. He had glory himself. He already came up the Hooke's law of the spring constant and all that, which is translated into short-range forces, and I won't go into that. I want to eventually talk about that and its impact on changes of how we should view physics. But he was great, but he wasn't Newton. And what happened was that Newton came along. And Newton started to blow doors after doors on the intellectual structure that was then existent. And Halley had dreams of glory. And so he started to claim and try to control things, because he was much older than Newton. And he was driven by dreams of glory that were unfounded. Dreams of glory are the concept is that you acquire glory. And in the theory, the glory of Newton is huge because of his achievement. But dreams of glory are people who want that mantle, but don't have the personal resources to make it happen. So this is just a speculation. But these guys have fallen into something that they could live 1,000 years if they had never seen it. They could live 1,000 years and never develop it. But now they seem to have control over it. They don't know how to use it. They violate it left and right, like I explained on the book, our primary property. But dreams of glory it's the most powerful opiate for the ego that has ever been seen. Like I said, Professor talked about this over and over again. It's an opiate to the ego. And once you take some of it, it becomes addictive. And you will do anything to fulfill what you think is your dreams of glory. In the process, you may become more and more irrational. You may step over all the concepts that you're quote-unquote protecting. And Professor said, it's one of the great dangers of our species. So I don't know what is motivating them. I don't think they're so chintzy as I mentioned in the last thing. I don't think it was for the money. I think they were using the money and they saw it as, the day in and day out. Look, we've got $2 million and we'll keep his estate going and we'll grow it and we'll do all the rest, and we need money to do this. So they, on a daily basis, don't get me wrong, money is nice.
Yeah.
But I think at the deepest level, Professor Galambos hit it out of the park in seeing this pattern over and over and over again throughout history. And we're just the most recent expression of history.
Mm-hmm.
They may have dreams of glory. And this may be the ultimate demonstration of what Professor said. One of the greatest dangers for human survival is the dreams of glory. And they are sitting at the doorstep of the information and knowledge that could survive us, allow our species to survive. And they're holding it back because of their dreams of glory. And it could cost our species. What a proof of how great Professor was. I prefer not to see it.
Yeah.
But that's it. But it's just my opinion.
Okay. All right. Well, that concludes, I think, unless there's a question you want to answer that I didn't think to ask.
No, you did a wonderful job.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think that will be it for the book, but you never know.
You never know.
All right.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.